Thursday Q&A. Are you ready? Am I ready? Are we all ready? A few housekeeping things before I jump into questions today. As always, a big thank you. Where are we? A big thank you to Typon for sponsoring our lives. This is a lot of years with Typon, and I really, really appreciate their support of WWGOA and everything they've done for the channel, which means they're also doing stuff for you by default. The other thing is, if you look down a little bit on the page you're on, you're going to see a banner that talks about upcycling sawdust. So I don't know about you, but in this shop, I make a lot of dust. And whether I'm sweeping out the table saw or emptying my dust collectors or all of the above, it's nice to have something to do with that. One thing that happens here a lot is the making of fire starters. But anyway, have a look at that guide, and it's going to give you some really creative ideas of what to do with the copious amounts of sawdust you create in your shop. All that being said, there are already questions on here, and I've said this before. I appreciate that. There's nothing wrong with posting the questions ahead of time, and in fact, often it's helpful to me in my brain, because then I can look at the question before we go live, and if I need to research an answer, I'm pointing to my computer. If I need to research an answer, I can. If I need to figure some other stuff out, I can. So it's always cool if you want to put questions there ahead of time, and then we can jump right in. So David asks, I just purchased the Harvey Alpha HW something 52 Pro, looking for suggestions for the best in dial indicators, both magnetic and none, for aligning the saw, both digital and analog, or your thoughts. So I don't know what saw. I'm assuming that's a table saw if we're talking about aligning. So let me grab a thing. I think I know right where it is. So when hang on, there we go. So when David asks about dial indicators, what generally with a table saw, not generally, with a table saw, read your owner's manual, that's step one. And what you need to do is get the blade of the saw aligned to the miter gauge slots of the saw. There's a protocol for that. Then you align the rib fence to the miter gauge slots, and that gets the rib fence aligned to the blade. So a great way to do that is with a dial indicator. I don't know. I'm looking for branding. Oh, Master Gauge is the brand on this. So let me get you in where you can see what I'm looking at. Here's how this works. This component goes in the miter gauge slot. This dial indicator, that's a spring-loaded tip. So that's going to kiss the blade. And then as you move from a forward position to a back position, the gauge is going to tell you if you're parallel or not. Read the owner's manual to know what adjustments to make. If you're not familiar with dial indicators, the way this works is that with pressure on that tip, it's moving the needle. Each of those little lines on there is 1/1000th of an inch. So with a table saw, generally you want to be about 3/1000ths or less within parallel from the front of the blade to the back of the blade. So that's why we need an instrument like this in order to measure that. So again, this particular brand, it's called a Super Bar. The company is or was Master Gauge. I don't actually know if they're still in business or not. Let me give you a zoom. So see that? Master Gauge is the brand. Super Bar is, I believe that only refers to that component right there. And then let me just look and see what else, because I've got a box full of stuff. I think that's the only one that's actually specifically a table saw setup tool. I do know Woodpeckers has one. There are a lot of companies that have similar arrangements. The arrangement being something has to go into the miter gauge slot, and then you can travel back and forth with that to read off the blade. Then for me, when I'm doing the fence, so again, it's, this is a commutative property for math. If A equals B and B equals C, C equals A. If the blade is parallel to the miter gauge slot and the fence is parallel to the miter gauge slot, therefore the fence is parallel to the blade. So when I'm checking the fence, this goes into the miter gauge slot, bears up against the fence, and then as I move this back and forth, I can tell if the fence is parallel to the slot and make that correction. So this is pretty old. It could be 30 years old. And like I said, Woodpeckers, I know, makes one, which is similar in that it nests into the miter gauge slot, and I'm sure other companies do as well. But it's not something I've tool tested or evaluated in recent times. So I am a statistic of one telling you that one works, has worked for me, but there are other systems out there. All right, so I'm going to talk about this a second because this comes up. David goes on to say, not sure where to see response to his questions. So here's the deal, Schlemiel. If you put a question onto a live, and whether that's the 11 o'clock live that we do or this 4 o'clock Q&A, if you put a question there and I verbally answer the question, that's where you're going to get the answer. So either if you post the question early, like before 4 o'clock Central Time on the second Thursday of the month, then you got to come back and watch the live. And if I get to the question, I'm going to answer it. I answer them in the order in which they're posted. So if, like David, you're the first question on the list, that question is going to be answered at 4:05. If you're the 50th question on the list, it could be 4:35, 4:41, 4:52. I don't know. So then you would just have to scrub through the live to see where it is. But my point out of this being, there are no printed answers to these questions. It's all verbal, just like we're doing right now. In other scenarios where you watch a specific video on something and you post a question on that video, Paul, my friend Paul, or myself will write out an answer. Customer service posts the answer. So in that case, it's in written form. Okay. Mike asks, if you make wood buttons / blocks to attach a tabletop to an apron, what direction should the grain run on the button or blocks? Or does grain direction not even matter? And only the cross grain and long grain slot direction matter. I don't really get that part. And only the cross grain and long grain slot direction matter. So let's do the first part because that I get. So making buttons, I've got one laying over here. I'm coming right back. What one can do, I just keep talking so you know I'm actually coming back. What one can do, instead of buying commercially made tabletop fasteners, which could be figure eights or Z-clips, one can make them. And I'll zoom you in on this in a second. So shop made ones, they're very, very easy to make. The way this would work is that in the apron of the table, you're going to cut a groove into the apron. That component of this is going to go into that groove. This particular one doesn't have this hole in it. That step needs to happen still. So then when you put on the tabletop, this goes like this. That goes into the groove in the apron. And then when I drive a screw, that's what fastens this to the bottom of the tabletop. To answer the first part of the question, you have to have the grain going this way. Because if the grain were going this way, when you drive that screw, you're going to easily snap this. The grain has to be parallel to this. Then maybe the second part of the question is, where on the table do we locate those? So if the table grain is going just like this one, this grain is going from my left to my right. If that's the case on your table, then we're definitely going to put tabletop fasteners from the apron, trying to get that where you can see it, from this apron up into the top, the apron that's perpendicular to the grain direction of the top. If it's a big table, there's nothing wrong with also putting them into these aprons that are parallel to the grain. You have to be a little bit more careful with those because, of course, what we're asking this to do is to slide back and forth in the groove as this tabletop changes dimension seasonally. When we put them this way, if you make them too tight, you could restrict that movement and either get a crack in the table or maybe mess up the apron, the rails. So you just want to make sure you don't over tighten them and you leave some wiggle room. Don't bottom these out in the groove. Put them partway in the groove and then secure them so that there's still a little bit of wiggle room. Let me know if I'm not interpreting the second part of your question correctly. Charlie says, my table saw is old, but still works. One of the miter slots has rust in it from being stored in an outbuilding for 10 plus years. What this means is that my miter bar will not slide smooth the whole way. Adjust it. Hang on, I got to reread this. All right, so I get it. The slot is rusty. What this means is that any miter bar will not slide smooth the whole way. Adjust so it is good at start, then lose as you go. What is best way to fix it? Well, you got to get the rust out. So if I'm reading this right, I think what you got is because of rust buildup inside the slot, it's effectively changed the width of the slot. They're typically 3/4 of an inch wide. So you've maybe got spots where the travel of the miter bar is being restricted by the rust, which is like grown to the inside. So that travel is being restricted by the rust, and that's where you're getting in trouble. So you need to have the slot, in order for the miter gauge to work effectively and be accurate, the slot has to be the same width from the front to the back. So to remove rust internally like that, I would wrap very fine sandpaper on a hardwood block and then use a little bit of WD-40 as a lubricant. And you just got to very gently and conservatively sand the high spots off, sand the rust off, so that you end up maintaining the same width of slot from one end to the other. So it's not, as far as I'm aware, there's no correction you can make on the bar of the miter gauge. You got to make the correction in the slot so that it's uniform end to end. Lee says, I'm trying to make an end grain cutting board using mitered pieces. I'm having difficulty clamping the mitered pieces together and not having gaps because the pieces slip as the glue dries. So that's interesting. My brain was anticipating slip as I clamp them. Doesn't seem to be a clamping issue. Seems to be as the glue dries. I don't get that. Because if they're secure in clamps, well, then he or she goes on to ask, any tips on how I can better clamp? So maybe it is a clamping issue. So I think what we're up against here, it all makes sense, is we've got a bunch of ramps. And I have no fingernails, so I can't flip a page. So we're trying to glue together a bunch of ramped or tapered stuff. So if I were to guess, making an end grain cutting board, so maybe what they're trying to do with mitered pieces, it's interesting. So maybe what they're fixing to do is a glue up that kind of looks like this. Or something. So if you only close it this way, it ain't going to work, because when you squeeze in this direction, these two parts are going to slide against each other, and that's going to change. If this is the deal, if this is really the configuration, get that so you can see it. What I would do, you need a clamping caul here that's holding these surfaces in alignment, and another clamping caul here that's holding them in alignment, and then clamp end to end. So that this board, this caul, and this caul are preventing these parts from being able to slide past each other. These, of course, have to be treated with something. Packing tape is a real simple solution for that. Cover this inside face with packing tape, then it won't stick to the glue. I suspect that in order for this to have a good glue surface, so it can get glued to the next piece, you're going to have to run these faces, top and bottom, through a surface sander to clean them up after this. Because it's probably, even with cauls on there, I would say it's very unlikely that you're going to end up with these pieces all in plane with each other when this is done. So I would use a caul, then, so you're going to clamp these against the face, clamp it end for end. After this is dry, send this face and this face through a drum sander in order to clean them up. And then you can come back and clamp all these strips in this direction in order to end up with your cutting board. I'd have to, it's an interesting idea. I would have to mess with that to see what that would look like. I'm having a hard time visualizing, is the juice worth the squeeze? Meaning, is it such a cool look when you're done with all those mitered pieces that it's worth, that's a lot of putzing around to get that to come together. But maybe when we're done, I'm gonna Google miter end grain cutting board image and see what they look like. Catherine asks, I have a teensy amount of Varathane premium wood stain colonial maple, oil-based. There's a lot of pigment left on the bottom of the can. How can I stretch the stain? Can I mix it with water, or is a solvent my only solution? Yeah, definitely not water. So you know it's oil-based. So oil-based means, in all likelihood, when you read the can and it says clean up brushes with blank, it's probably mineral spirits. So whatever the recommended solvent is for cleaning the stuff, that's what you have to use if you want to add a little bit to the can to like reactivate the pigment in the bottom of the can. So it would be mineral spirits or paint thinner or turpentine or whatever. It's in all likelihood one of those three, as opposed to denatured alcohol or lacquer thinner or something like that. So yeah, don't add water, because I think you're gonna have an oil and water scenario. It's gonna the water is not gonna put the pigment into solution. Daniel says, I purchased a Grizzly 17-inch bandsaw, have been through the setups multiple times. I'm confident everything is dialed in, but I have a pretty good vibration on mainly the table. Do you recommend I double check anything, or a common item that causes vibration in bandsaws? So there are maybe some relatively common things. So one thing I would do is call Grizzly customer service and say, here's the model I have. Are you, Grizzly people, familiar with any inherent thing in this saw that other people have called and talked about. Because then they're the experts on the tool. So I would definitely call Grizzly. I would also take the blade off. Like, we got to do a little bit of detective work. So take the blade off, and with no blade on the saw, run the saw and see if in that scenario you still have vibration. If you do, that would indicate to me something is out of round, like the lower wheel is maybe out of round. I don't know. If you run it minus the blade and it runs smoothly, the other thing I would do is, we don't have a way to power the upper wheel without a blade being on there. I would just hand spin the upper wheel and look at it to see if it's doing any kind of jumping. So again, we're looking for out of round. Is the upper wheel visibly, obviously going, spinning out of round? The other thing, the thing that can make it look out of round and the wheel itself is not out of round, is that the tires, if the tires were replaced, they maybe weren't replaced correctly. What can happen with that is that, especially rubber tires, when you stretch them, when a person stretches them around the wheel, they're not stretched uniformly, and there's a high spot on the tire, which is just what it sounds like. There's a spot where that rubber is thicker than it is anyplace else. So because it's thicker there, you have a high spot. Every time that's under the blade, it's going to make it with that exact noise, in fact. So you can look for, when you're freewheeling, with no blade on there and you're looking at the wheel spin, look for those high spots. And then if you have a high spot, determine if it's in the tire. The other thing that can cause vibration in a bandsaw is if the tires are not clean. If you or somebody has used the saw a lot with sappy woods, like pine and cherry, and you get a big buildup of resin and sawdust on the tires, that's something else. You're effectively creating a high spot by having that buildup. So then what's going to happen is, again, you're going to cause the blade to bounce, which is going to cause vibration, which is going to get resolved by just cleaning the tires. And you can clean the tires with a mild solvent, nothing as strong as lacquer thinner, because that can dissolve the tire. Something like mineral spirits is a good cleaner for bandsaw tires. And then from there, so if, as far as you can tell, well, I don't know. I think we've spoken to all the potential issues there. If you've got vibration, either the wheels are out of round, the tires are out of round, or there's a high spot on the tires that's making the blade bounce, which is what's causing vibration on the bandsaw. So that's what I would look at, in addition to starting by calling Grizzly and saying, what's the skinny, Minnie, with this particular saw? And maybe it's got some kind of an inherent manufacturing thing that they can tell you about. Sorry, I lost my spot. Here we go. Harold says, when you are flattening or leveling a slab or a cutting board, are the rails the router jig rides on level? No. So it's an interesting thing. And I've seen woodworkers get in trouble with this. Like if I put a router sled on here, on this bench, it doesn't gain me anything to put a level on here and make sure that that jig is level, that setup is level, because maybe the bench isn't level. So if I end up shimming one end of that system to make it level, it's potentially at that point no longer parallel to the bench. So to answer this question, all I care about with a slab mill is that the tops of the rails that the router is going to ride on are parallel to the surface. And that comes from the manner in which, if it's shop made, the manner in which you build the system, or if it's commercially made, the manner in which the manufacturer built the system. And what I was going to say, I've seen woodworkers get in trouble with this, is I've seen people build a cabinet and set it on this bench and then use a level to establish shelf locations, fixed shelf. That may or may not work. Again, if this bench is out of level, which it could be just a little bit askew sitting here, if this bench is not level and the cabinet's on here and I use a level to put fixed shelves in it, the shelves are going to be crooked. The shelves got to go in relative to the cabinet, not relative to the world. And a level, like the one hanging right there, tells you the world view. It doesn't tell you this shop view. So no is the short answer to that. Bernard says, I'm starting to do pen turning and making cutting boards. Is there any species of wood that is not recommended? Considering using poplar, red oak, maple, mahogany, and hickory. So I don't know if we're same question, both topics. For pen turning, it's pretty wide open. But I've turned pens out of corn cobs, which is an interesting thing. For pens, I've used resin, like I said, corn cobs, resin being epoxy, a bazillion different things. For cutting boards, you don't want to use a porous wood, an open grain wood. I personally would not use red oak in a cutting board. The rest of the ones you have there, what you're looking for is close grained woods. So the woods, I'm looking outside because it's starting to pour, which you may hear in just a second because I have a steel roof. So close grained woods, hardwoods would be walnut, maple, cherry. Poplar is close grained. I've never used it in a cutting board. It's a little bit soft, just physically soft for a cutting board. So I would look for stuff. We've got a video on what's called Janka hardness, Janka. You can look that up on WWGOA.com, and that will explain what Janka hardness is. Once you know what it is, you can look for woods like walnut, maple, and cherry that all have similar Janka hardness. If I were guessing, I'm fairly certain that poplar is going to be quite a bit below where those other three hardwoods are. So close grained hardwoods. Marcy says, hello, I'm replacing kitchen cabinet pulls. Issue is that the old holes are 3 1/8. The new ones are 3. How weird. I wonder where the 3 1/8 pulls. I mean, there's industry standard for pulls of 3-inch and 4-inch and 5-inch has been in place for a long time. What is the best way to get the new ones to fit? Plug one hole and drill a new one. Cabinets will be painted. Oh yeah, you're golden if you're painting. So yeah, putty, you could putty both of the old holes if you want. I mean, if you're on a drawer front and the pull is this way, you want to drill 2 new holes. Otherwise, the new pull will be off center by 1/8 of an inch, right? So in that case, what you want to do is fill both holes, sand them, paint them, drill 2 new holes, and with your pull centered. And I would probably, I don't know. I was going to say I'd probably fill them all and paint everything and drill all new holes. But I guess on a cabinet door where it's vertical, you're probably okay. Use one hole, fill the other one, and then drill new ones from there. And I'm obviously way back and forth in my head on this, because what's going to happen when you go to drill the new one is you're drilling a hole kind of in the same spot where you just put a bunch of wood putty. So I'm going to take back what I just said. I would fill all the holes and re-drill all the holes so that you're drilling in fresh wood. Yeah, and if you're paint grade, you're going to be fine. You'll never see them if you do a good job filling the holes. Mike has a 15 to 16 inch diameter, 5 to 6 inch thick oak cookie. That's pretty cool and heavy. I'd like to be able to cut it into 2. Okay, I got it. It's a little hard to read just because there's a lot of numbers and decimal points and stuff. End of the day, 16-inch diameter, let's call it 6-inch thick, wants to go through it this way. So what I did once when I had to do this is picture, if you will, dig, if you will, a picture, as Prince said. So if you put the cookie on this bench, this is predicated on owning a chainsaw. Put the cookie on this bench, and then I didn't do this on my bench. I did it outside on a stand. Then what I did is I put on the bench spacers that were the height I wanted to establish in the new cookie. So in your case, if it's 6 inches and to a chainsaw, we're going to lose 3/8 kerf. So you want those spacers to be a little bit under 3 inches. And you want a bunch of them because it's unrealistic to say with a chainsaw, I'm pretty good at using a chainsaw, but it's unrealistic that I'm going to come in horizontally starting on one side and cut perfectly to the other side, keeping everything parallel. So what I did is I started on the blocks on this side. For the bar of the chainsaw, use those spacer blocks as a gauge, cut in a little bit. And then I came around over here, use those spacer blocks as a gauge, cut in a little bit, rinse and repeat, working my way all the way around. So basically you're establishing, I don't know, a 2-inch deep, 3-inch deep kerf all the way around the perimeter of the log. And then repeat and repeat. Repita. And eventually you're going to get to where you're at the center of the log. And that would be a good way to do it. Alternatively, what one could do, 16 inches isn't that big. Find somebody in your area with a bandsaw mill and tell them what you got. And with a bandsaw mill would make short work of cutting that. And realistically, 6-inch thick, you could get 3 cookies out of that maybe with a bandsaw mill. You're not going to get 3 cookies with a chainsaw because you lose so much kerf. So a bandsaw mill would be the best way to do it. Herb says, last month I asked you, that'd be me, about running deep poured epoxy charcuterie boards through a planer. The walnut wood within the board stood proud, so sanding was going to take a while. Just to report, it worked great. After several grits of sanding, the boards finished great with walrus cutting board oil. So that's cool. This is something we've talked about a lot is should you or should you not run epoxy through a planer? And if with so many of today's planers having carbide cutters in them, that makes it a lot more forgiving. The carbide is going to stand up to the epoxy pretty well. But in any case, I'm glad to hear that the answer I gave for Herb a month ago actually worked out correctly. And everything is okie and dokie. William says, not a question, but a thank you. This is nice. I followed through on 2 videos I got links to in my email this week. My clamps cleaned up like new with bleach in a PVC pipe. I'm going to come back to that. And I made my wife 2 striped rolling pins that she loves, and it was fun to make. So that's good. So rolling pins first. I did a video recently on turning a French rolling pin. Visual aids are good. This is what that looked like. So that's a French rolling pin. This one's obviously not done yet and still have to get cut. But what's nice about this is, as opposed to a traditional rolling pin, this is very, very easy to turn. And then when you create the blank with the material on the bias like this, it gives it a cool look. And I've had so many people see this and be very confused about how I inlaid the stripes at an angle. You know, their perception is kind of like I turned a piece of wood and then I cut all these colors into it. So that's a cool project. To go back to the clamp cleaning, that worked amazingly well. It's not bleach, it's vinegar. So if you've not seen that video, if your clamps look like mine used to look, which is there are gobs of glue all over them. You make a PVC standpipe, fill it with vinegar, immerse the bar in there, and just give it time. Walk away. And if you wait long enough, the beads of glue will basically just wipe right off the metal clamp. It works amazingly well. Frederick has said, Master Gauge is still in business. There you go. Google is your friend. So thank you, Frederick, so you could, the gauge I showed initially, that dial indicator for setting up the table saw, this guy, you should still be able to get that. We will be teaching on the road soon. I hope to attend one of your classes, not sure where to find them. Are you having some at your shop? So there's a bunch coming up. This fall, I'm gone from here a lot. So if you are in North Carolina, or if you want to travel to North Carolina, I'm at the Klingspor store in Hickory in October. I'm not 100% sure when. If you are in or want to travel to a state in the east, Massachusetts, I believe. No, Connecticut. Geez, this is how much I'm traveling. I can't remember where I'm going. It's the woodworking school in New Haven, Connecticut, Bob Van Dyke School out there. I'm there for 4 days. Now, transparency, at least 2 of the classes I'm teaching there are already full. I believe there are openings in a 3rd class I'm doing there, but you have to check online with Bob's website to see what's available. October 30th, I'm in Eau Claire, Wisconsin at Farrell Equipment. That's a 1-day gig. That's a Thursday, I think. It's a weekday thing. So yes, so the short answer to this is, if you look at my website, georgevondriska.com, my schedule is always there. And it'll say where I am and what I'm doing. So then if you want to come and see where I am and what I'm doing, that'll let you know. And then classes in the shop get reverse engineered from when I'm on the road. I'm teaching so much away from here this fall that there won't be a lot of classes here in Hammond this fall. James says, no, wait, there's another one. What degree should picnic table legs be? Well, I'm going to guess 5 degrees or 10 degrees. I have not built a picnic table for a really long time. I would definitely lay this out. You can do a couple things. Get a big piece of cardboard, draw the whole thing out, draw the legs at 5 degrees and 10 degrees, see how that looks. Also, a good thing would be to mock up, if we're talking about the traditional like forest preserve park table where the legs are like this, almost kind of an A shape on the end. I would definitely recommend mocking one up, cut some 2x6s, put it together, see how that looks, see how it feels, and go from there. Also, a real easy thing would be Google picnic table plans and see what other people have done. So I'm going to even take back my first answer and say, I don't know, and recommend that you just Google it and find a plan for it rather than re-engineering the whole thing. People have made so many cool picnic tables, and there's a thing about in that design where the leg is angled, a horizontal piece picks up the seats. So there's a lot of geometry to this where when you're on that seat, you want to be in a position that's comfortable relative to the top. That's going to be affected by the angle of the legs. There's a lot of stuff going on. I would look for a plan. Don't listen to me at all. Look for a plan. James says, I have a technique for precise doweling that's worked well if the dowels don't need to be hidden. I tack glue the joint together, drill and insert the dowels later through both parts together to add the strength. The parts make perfectly because I can align them precisely during gluing and use contrast hardwood. So it's not a question, it's just a technique, which makes a lot of sense. It's simply it's like screwing parts together after you've tacked them with a brad, or in this case, doweling them together after the glue is crabbed. So makes perfect sense. Brian will be making a bookcase, 84 high, 42 wide, 12 deep. Material is 4/4, 1 inch thick, by 12 ash for the sides, top, and bottom. Can I use the boards as is, or should I cut and glue back together to minimize warp? I mean, for centuries, woodworkers used wide stuff. There's so many it depends to this. So it really depends on how it was cut, how it was dried. Is it acclimated perfectly to your shop? Is it, one, you need to buy a moisture meter if you don't have one, and make sure that the wood is dry. Then it needs to come into your shop. It needs to acclimate. No matter what, you got to do that. I would, given that there are a lot of variables here, I would probably lean toward cutting everything into narrower pieces and then gluing stuff back together. And that doesn't mean cutting a 12-inch wide board into 4-inch strips and then gluing those 3 4-inch strips back together. You're going to take 4-inch strip number 1, glue it to 4-inch strip number 15 so that they're from different boards and they offset each other. So I would probably default to buying the insurance of cutting those 12-inch parts down and gluing them back into the width that you need. James has a Laguna Fusion F3 table saw with 2 standard riving knives. 1 on table and 1 as part of overhead dust extractor. I also got Laguna's thin riving knife. I'm worried about forgetting to change the riving knife when I change blades. When I go from thin kerf blade to full kerf blade, if I forget to change the riving knife to standard, will it continue to work properly, or would there be safety concerns about doing this? If I left the thin riving knife in and used it with a full kerf blade, is that an issue? I would match the riving knife to the blade. So is it maybe okay to be thinner than the kerf? Maybe. I just wouldn't take the chance. Just keep track of it and match the riving knife to the kerf of the blade that you're using, then you're 100%. So Catherine circled back to the stain and trying to stretch the can of stain. Apparently it's mineral spirits is what it calls for on the can. So she's going to try that route. John says vibration on the bandsaw could be the feet are not on the floor correctly. That's a good point. So check if the saw wobbles, if the bandsaw wobbles, and if it does, fix that, and then see if you still have vibration. And Daniel, I'm assuming we're back to the bandsaw thing, says, I have a support ticket with Grizzly open. I'm waiting for a response. And it is level. The bandsaw is level, so it's something else. And then Jess, who's always does a great job behind the scenes, has put a link in the comments for that Janka hardness video. So that's what I referenced earlier. If you want to use science, not guesswork, to understand how hard is ash versus maple versus cherry, Janka hardness will tell you that. So watch that video. That'll give you an understanding of what Janka hardness is. Then you can get a Janka hardness chart, and you can have that to have and to hold, and it'll identify woods for you and where they fall on that chart. It's interesting. It's if nothing else, it's very interesting to look at and get a feel for like southern yellow pine and hard maple and jarrah, and some woods that are ironwood, some woods that are just incredibly hard and where they fit relative to everything else. I have a pine cookie with a big crack in it. I want to fill the crack with epoxy. Do you know what the moisture level should be before I pour epoxy? Dry, 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 dry. So one learns by doing sometimes, unless you think, I never make a mistake. I make a lot of mistakes. When my middle kid was still working for me, when Ginny was working here, who recently got married, congratulations, Ginny, we did an epoxy pour with some material that still had a pretty high moisture content. This was very early in my epoxy days. I didn't really understand the product very well. It foamed like nobody's business. The epoxy reacted with that moisture, and it was like the blob that ate New York City was here in the shop, foaming out of this little mold we had poured it into. So I'm going to say, I'm going to qualify my answer, which is always, if you're using Total Bolt product, call Total Bolt, great customer service, and say, what should the moisture level be at in a piece of wood before I pour epoxy over it? Or moss epoxy, or stone coat epoxy. Whoever it is, ask them. I'm going to say it probably needs to be at 6% or so to make sure you don't have some kind of contraindication when you pour epoxy into that material. It's got to be dry. Don't mess with it. It's another, if you're doing a lot of this, if you're doing a lot of woodworking and you don't know a moisture meter, put a moisture meter on your Christmas list soon and have somebody get you one, because you really got to know where you're at with material before you start working with it. And epoxy is a striking example of where that can go wrong. David, I guess this is a comment, not a pregunta, not a question. I watched the video on the micro jig lock miter. It's a cool product. So if you're not familiar with that, lock miters are a pain to set up. Micro jig has changed the game completely on what a lock miter router bit looks like. So the overall profile is the same, but they've machined a component into it that makes setup much simpler. And you're just about, if you do the setup carefully according to their instructions, probably your first lock miter joint is going to be perfect. And if you're interested in that concept, that video is in the can on WWGOA. As always, use the search bar at the top of the page, search lock miter, that's going to come up and you can watch that. Question about the tool chest behind you, is it shop built? So are we talking about this one or this one? I guess you can't really see this one. So this tool chest, you could find that. I built that when I was writing for American Woodworker magazine 20 years ago, probably. That article is online somewhere. So you could probably search Vondriska stack of drawers, Vondriska tool chest, Vondriska something. Popular Woodworking bought American Woodworker, so they're republishing all of that stuff under their name now, and I have seen that article online. The little tool, there's one back here, there's one there that's made out of reclaimed pine with dovetailed corners. That's a very cool tool chest. That is shop made. It's also a WWGOA project. So if you want to make that, you could find that online. And then the other, if that's what you mean by a tool chest, that's the cordless drill station. That's a WWGOA project. And you can search GOA and find that online. What do you use for splines? Yes. Stuff, wood. I don't know. It depends. Generally, if I'm putting in a spline, I probably want it to contrast with the rest of the thing. So if it's a walnut box, maybe it's a maple or a cherry spline. If it's a cherry box, maybe it's a walnut spline. So there's no single answer to that. It depends on what look I'm trying to achieve in the project. James has some spalted maple, 2 halves of about a 2-foot wide log, 10 inches in diameter. So I don't get that. 2-foot wide log. So I'm going to change that to 2 foot long, maybe 10 inches in diameter. Very fresh, 38% moisture now. He owns a moisture meter. I know I need several months to dry it before I start doing something. Are there treatments I should do to strengthen it or make it more workable? So the problem with spalting, I just had a bazillion pieces of spalted stuff because I'm working with it on another project. Let me see if I can find one. This is spalting, that black stuff. The problem with this is for that to start to look like that, that piece of maple was wet. And there's a fine line between spalting and rotten. So one, you gotta, like, if you're drying it now, when it no longer has access to moisture, the spalting process is gonna stop. 2, the spalting is a fungus. Once we've eliminated the moisture from the equation, the fungus is benign. So to preemptively answer a couple questions there. This stuff that I'm working with here is actually being made into a table, and it's a little softer than I like. If I grab it and I do this with what little thumbnail I have, there's a dimple right there from my thumbnail. That's not going to make a great tabletop. So what I'm going to do with the table is when it's been made into a tabletop but not finished yet, so it's been sanded, it's going to get a coat of penetrating epoxy. The penetrating epoxy is going to, it's doing just what it says. It's going to penetrate into the material. It's plastic, so it's going to rigidify, if that's a word. It's going to stiffen up all of these fibers, so you'll no longer be able to put your thumbnail in it. Then when it's past that step, when that epoxy is dry, it'll get sanded, and then I'll just use my normal top coat over that. So a base coat of shellac, top coat of water-based sealer, same thing I always do. And in the end, it's gonna look like this wood under finish is what it's gonna look like. But the penetrating epoxy is key to rigidify, to get it more, to make the wood more durable, so that as a tabletop, every time you touch it, you're not putting a dent in it. The other thing that's interesting, and I've got the setup here to do it, but I've not done it yet, is cactus juice. When you're working with not just spalted stuff, but anything, cactus juice is a stabilizer. You need a vacuum chamber in order to take advantage of it. This piece of wood would go into the vacuum chamber. Cactus juice gets poured over the top. When we apply vacuum to this, which sucks, see what I did there? When we apply vacuum to this, that forces the cactus juice to impregnate the material. And then there's a protocol you follow. Read the directions. It comes out of the cactus juice once it's saturated. I think it goes in an oven for a period of time. There are additional steps to follow. But when you see stuff like this, and it's green or pink or purple or blue, and it's got that color throughout, it wasn't stained, it was impregnated. And it was probably done with this cactus juice. So those are a couple things you can do with spalted. And that being said, like, I've got spalted stuff. This bowl is made out of spalted elm. And I wouldn't do anything to that except finish sanding it. So it's spalted, it's a little bit soft, but for a hollow vessel like that, I don't care. All you're going to do is look at, it's kind of an objet d'art. So this wouldn't merit the steps of applying penetrating epoxy or cactus juice to that, because I don't need it to be a piece of steel when it's done. It's just a decorative thing. Rich says, our final question. I'm looking to refinish my daughter's dining table. There are several places where small slivers of finish about an 1/8 inch wide have come off, leaving raw wood showing. The tabletop is distressed, so it can't be sanded smooth. I do not know what top coat was used on the table. What are your recommendations to match the existing color? Once I've restained those places where bare wood is showing, how best to refinish the table? Wow. How weird. Slivers of finish, 1/8 inch wide, have come off. You need somebody much smarter in finishing than me to answer this question. This is all pretty complicated. Like, because the other thing I would be concerned with here is if you have a spot where 1/8 inch slivers are releasing, is the rest of the top coat waiting to release? So something's wrong with this picture. So is there a problem that needs to be fixed in the big scheme of things? Like, do you need to get all the finish off rather than try to patch it? Is the smarter money to get everything off and start from scratch? I don't know. This is a thing that I would take to somebody who really knows furniture refinishing and have them look at it. And even if it's like, you're gonna do the work yourself, but you're gonna pay them some money to consult on it and tell you what to do. I think in the big scheme, that would be well worth every penny that cost you to consult, because you're gonna get a rifle shot of what you should do to make it right. Other than that, it's gonna be, and on my part, it would be a bunch of guesswork about this. I think you really need a pro to tell you what to do and how to do it. That's gonna wrap us up. So, a bunch of stuff. Again, thanks to Tight Bond. Thanks to you for watching, because if you weren't watching, we wouldn't do this. A lot of good questions today, and if you want to, as I said before, preload questions before the September live, that's fine, and then I'll get to them when we go live. Grab that guide for upcycling sawdust. Scroll down a little bit. You'll see it there. Some cool creative ideas. If you are on the road and I'm on the road, maybe I'll see you in Hickory or Connecticut or the other place, Eau Claire, when I'm teaching at those places. Other than that, thanks for watching, and Jess, you can check us out.